Ukraine is celebrating its Day of Independence as well as marking 6 months since Russia invaded the country. That invasion has devastated Ukraine. And it's also had tremendous repercussions for the world. A refugee crisis, for one. The United Nations estimates some 5 million Ukrainians have left, most headed for other European countries. 7 million people have been displaced inside of Ukraine. The Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports led to a massive disruption of shipments from one of the world's biggest grain producers. That in turn affected tens of millions of people around the globe who depend on that grain. Our correspondent, Matthias Bullinger, recently visited with those who lived through the earliest attack on a residential building in Kiev.
Up in the sky, they're working to fix the damage.
It was a rocket. It came from over there, like this, and sliced off a corner of the building.
It was day 3 of the war. This was the first residential building in Kyiv to be hit. They've started reconstruction even though the war hasn't yet ended. The city council is paying for most of the repairs, but residents like Olena Chumakova are also raising funds.
This was the epicenter of the explosion. There were 2 apartments here, and if you look over here, this corner, there was another room here. The rocket took the corner off and the whole room. The explosion also hit the 2 apartments, above and below.
The destroyed room was the one most families in the apartments use as a kid's bedroom. The block was relatively new, built for Kiev's emerging middle class. The rocket wrecked 4 floors, but no one was killed. They were either in different parts of their apartments or had left the city, like one family who'd fled to Germany.
They had a camera in the room, and they could see on their phone how their flat was destroyed. I can't imagine what that feels like. They were safe, but they still saw this happening. It's terrible.
4 floors further down, Olena's apartment was undamaged, even the glass is intact. Still, she's happy she wasn't home when the rocket hit. Some neighbors who were there suffered a terrible shock and still have trouble returning. They stay in close contact.
The calamity has united us. Many of us have become friends. We understand how important it is to stick together. And when the war is over, I'm sure we will quarrel again.
Defiance from the people whose building was the first in Kyiv to be hit in this war.
With Ukraine marking Independence Day and 6 months since Russia's invasion, I asked DW correspondent Roman Goncharenko in Kiev how Ukrainians feel about these 2 significant milestones.
Well, with mixed feelings, I would say. It's a war of independence that Ukraine is fighting 31 years after it proclaimed independence from the Soviet Union. And it's a very special day here. You can feel the tensity in the air. In the morning, it's a public holiday. The streets are still empty, but there are a few people walking down the central boulevard here in Kiev, Krishchatyk, just behind my back, where you can see dozens of scorched Russian tanks that were captured as Russia tried to capture Kiev, the capital, in the first days and weeks of this war. And this gives, of course, Ukrainians the sense of pride. Many people say, look, Russia has the second strongest army in the world and we were able to fight them back, and we're still fighting 6 months on. So they're very proud of that. But on the other hand, there is also sorrow. As I've said, this is a war of independence, and Ukrainians are paying a very high price for that. We do not have official figures, but observers here in Ukraine estimate that tens of thousands people died in these 6 months, military and civilians. So it's a very tense feeling here in Kiev, a feeling of pride, a feeling of joy, but also a feeling of sorrow. And people remember those dead. There is a moment of silence every day here in Kiev. But life goes on the other hand.
Well, the Ukrainian government has been warning that Russia could launch what it's calling brutal strikes today, on this day, targeting the capital, perhaps. How are Ukrainians preparing?
Well, the government has warned Ukrainians to avoid the city center, to stay vigilant, which is different from the beginning of the war, when there were Western warnings about the attack, and the government said, well, we do not believe that quite. So there was criticism of the government at that time. Now it's acting differently. So government officials were urged to stay home the whole week, to work from home. The public transport here in Kiev is running only until 21 hours at night, but on the other hand, people are still walking the streets. In other cities which are closer to the front line, like, for example, Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, the situation is very much different. That city is being shelled every day, every hour. People are dying there every day. And there is no train connection with Kharkiv, so Ukrainian Railways said on this Independence Day it's too dangerous to drive by train to Kharkiv, so there is a kind of lockdown there. I spoke to a young woman who came from Kharkiv to Kiev, and she said the situation here in the capital is so much different, she feels safe here.
DW's Roman Goncharenko reporting for us from Kiev. Roman, thank you so much. Although Ukraine is marking its Independence Day, as we just heard from our correspondent, Kiev has banned public celebrations and is warning that Russia may use the occasion for what it describes as an ugly use of force. DW reporter William Glucroft looks back on some of the major turning points in the war so far.
After months of speculation, warnings, fears, and a massive troop buildup on three sides of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin finally revealed his deadly intentions on February 24th. First, let's look at how things were on the eve of the war. Now, Russia already occupied the Crimean Peninsula in the south in 2014, and at the same time helped separatists take control of part of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. Now, in that conflict, the United Nations estimates 14,000 civilians have been killed in the years since. Now, starting February 24th, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by land, by sea, and by air. The Russian leader claims the Ukrainian government has committed crimes against Russian-speaking Ukrainians. But outside Russia, the war is seen as a desperate effort to stop Ukraine's further integration with the West, which Putin views as a threat to his power. Now, in the first stage of the war, until around the beginning of April, Russian forces pounded the capital, Kyiv, and other major urban centers like Kharkiv and Mariupol. Entire civilian areas were flattened. Millions of people fled to neighboring countries or to Ukraine's somewhat safer western region. But Russia underestimated Ukraine's resistance, and its military couldn't establish air superiority. It tried but failed to surround Kyiv and decapitate Ukraine's democratically elected government. So after several weeks of little progress from the north of the country, Russian commanders ordered a withdrawal to concentrate their firepower on the east. That is the war's second phase. Ukrainian troops were outmanned and outgunned, and they were forced to steadily retreat, allowing Russian forces to consolidate gains on the ground. Now, what you see here doesn't mean that Russia has full control of these areas. What we can say is that in the south and the east is where Russia has advanced the most and exerts some level of administrative control. It's these areas that have seen the heaviest fighting. And now we're in a third phase. Ukraine says it's fighting back with the help of U.S. and other Western weapons. Both sides have suffered tremendous losses, though it's impossible to put a precise figure on that. Same goes for the civilian toll, which the United Nations officially puts at 13,000 killed and wounded. But they acknowledge it's likely a gross undercount. Now, it's unclear what Putin's endgame is here as the war becomes one of attrition, whether Ukraine has the strength to push back against Russian advances, whether Russia has the resources to establish itself as an occupying power, and whether the winter ahead will freeze fighting and force some kind of deal.
That was DW's William Glucroft. Well, for more, we are now joined by Mike Martin. He is an author and speaker on conflict at King's College London. Welcome. We know now 6 months into the war, and Russia is bogged down in a conflict that seemingly has no end in sight. How much longer do you think this war is likely to continue? Oh,
I'm sorry, the end of your question broke up.
We seem to be having a bit of difficulty with the audio. I'll just repeat our question. Mike, just asking the question, how much longer do you expect Russia's war on Ukraine to continue?
I think we're going to see at least another 6 months. The period that we're in now is the run-up to winter, and both sides are keen to show as much progress as possible, because over winter, what Russia is planning to do is to use gas as a lever to separate Ukraine from its European allies, and Ukraine is keen to make as much progress as possible before winter. Everything is going to slow down after winter, and we won't really see any movement until the spring, so around the first birthday, the first anniversary of the invasion.
So you do anticipate a longer war. We're hearing from President Zelensky that Russia may choose to launch particularly brutal strikes today on their Day of Independence, also the 6-month mark of the conflict. What do you anticipate Russia to do?
Yes, I mean, we've actually seen this from Russia throughout the war, which are deliberate attacks on civilians. I mean, effectively what Putin is threatening is to bomb and attack with missiles civilian areas, and this is related to the recent assassination of Dugin's daughter, who was this Russian ideologue who's supportive of President Putin. And it's, in one way of interpreting it, actually, is that it's impotent. It's militarily impotent, because attacking civilians is a war crime, but it also doesn't achieve anything in military terms. And so the fact that Russia's attacking civilians rather than attacking the Ukrainian military in strategic terms is very stupid.
Ukraine is receiving weapons from the international community, but is it enough? And are these weapons being delivered fast enough to stop Russia from getting the upper hand?
The weapons flow is continuing, and it will continue. It is enough at the moment to stem the tide. The difficulty is, as we see at the moment, Ukraine is starting to transition to offensive operations. We've seen these attacks recently in Crimea on the airbase and on Sevastopol naval base. But to really go on the offensive, to take back large amounts of territory rather than the small amounts of territory that Ukraine has taken back recently, we need a much larger scale of weapons delivery, including specific things like armoured infantry fighting vehicles and smaller armoured vehicles and tanks.
That was Mike Martin from King's College London. Mike, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.